a warm welcome to everyone to this webinar. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. We've prepared some slides to help you guide through the presentation. Before I make a start, though, a big thank you to BAM for hosting us this afternoon, and also to Eliza from the events team for all her hard work behind the scenes. We couldn't be here and do this without them, and of course with all of you as delegates. As David has already highlighted, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So the Q&A are any questions that you would like Andrea and myself to answer later on. The chat is more for normal conversation, and we will pick them up at the end. As David said, we're aiming for no more of an hour of presentation so that we have plenty of time to engage in some conversation, albeit muted and via the Q&A box. So today's webinar derives from this paper entitled Interview-Based Research in Management and Organization Studies, Making Sense of the Plurality of Methodological Practices and Presentational Styles, which was published in Qualitative Research in Organizations and Management last year. You can access the paper, excuse me, via the publisher's web pages, or if your institution does not have a subscription, there is an open access version available via the ePrints function at Newcastle University. So this project was a review project, which Andrea and I conducted over the last 3 years or so, because if you look at research methods texts, there's a lot written about the actual conduct of interviews. So things about questions and the difference between open and closed questions, about the differences between face-to-face personal interviewing and telephone, or more recently, virtual interviews. You will also be able to read about analysis of qualitative data, very typically interview-based data, but very, very little about the writing up and the reporting. So we were really curious about this final stage in the research process of writing up interview-based research. And I'm hoping very much that whoever you are, if you are a PhD student or early career researcher, looking to write up your research, your first paper deriving from interview-based research, you will find some useful insights. But also, if you're more established and you may be involved in conference organization, in journal reviewing, research grant reviewing, involved in doctoral supervision, you will also take some really interesting points away from this project. Certainly, Andrea and I have been surprised several times and in a lot of ways throughout the project and the writing up of this particular paper. I think it goes without saying that interviewing is a common qualitative research method in our field. You will have noticed that I use the term interview-based research because it is being used in 3 main ways. 1, as a standalone method. 2, in a mixed methods design together with some quantitative data set, very typically surveys. And 3, in a multiple qualitative methods design. So combining interviews, for example, with observations or documentary sources, visual sources. And so interview-based research then is an umbrella term for what we looked at in this review. The focus of our paper was twofold. Firstly, we were interested in how the methodology was written up, which we called methodological practices. but then also how interview data was presented in empirical work, which we call presentational styles. I will say a bit more about the approach in a moment, but our review focused on so-called leading management and organization journals, because our assumption was that only work of the highest quality would be accepted by the editors of these journals. Now, of course, this does not mean that other high quality research isn't published elsewhere. But in these journals, I think the assumption that this almost represents a kind of gold standard is fair. But then as we went through the review, we considered, well, so what do our findings actually mean for evaluating the quality of interview-based research? And for those of you who have been in this domain for many, many years, of course, debates about how can we assess the quality of interview-based research or qualitative research more generally has been going on for 30, 40 years at least. So we also then wanted to tie in with that really important debate as templates are being discussed and the use of sort of quite formulaic writing in some journals. So there are vibrant debates about the quality of qualitative and specifically interview-based research. Now, the paper is very detailed and I won't be able, or we won't be able to go through everything this afternoon. So we've picked out some of the key points we think will be of interest to you. And we very much welcome or invite you to check in the paper for any details that are of particular relevance for you. So in terms of our approach, we reviewed a sample of 225 empirical journal articles published in the Financial Times 50 management and organization journals. We searched for the exact term interview in title, keyword, and abstract, because our assumption was that authors who foreground the interview method would have a particular interest in describing, explaining, and justifying their methodology. Now, this also means that our data set is not does not cover all empirical articles in these journals, because not all of them have the term interview in title, keywords, and abstract. In terms of time frame, we went for a 10-year period between 2009 and 2019. And that helps us to overcome any specific focus of editorial teams, because this period typically transcends the tenure of a specific editor or editorial team. We then went to the data set with quite an open mind, and we were looking at the practices relating to data collection, data analysis, and quality checks, as well as the reporting structure and methods of presenting data. And that left us through identifying and categorizing these practices with a wide variety of practices that authors use to describe, explain, and justify their methodology, but also in the way in which they presented their empirical materials. And that then led us to try and make sense of that plurality, as the subtitle of the paper suggests, by going back to Alverson's 3 onto epistemological paradigms of interview-based research, which will form the bulk of this presentation. So as part of our analysis, we considered, well, actually, where is in or how much interview-based research is published and with what kind of research design. So remember, this is the sample of our 225, and the figures shown here are the actual number of articles, and we did not modify them to take into account the number of issues each journal publishes a year and how many papers there are on average in each issue. So this is just absolute numbers. But we were really curious that interview only was the most prevalent research design in the data set, followed by mixed qualitative quantitative methods, and then the least prevalent was multiple qualitative methods. But even so, there isn't a huge difference in numbers here, which suggests to us that interview-based research in any of the three research designs can actually be published in these so-called leading journals. There isn't necessarily a prevalence or preference for one or the other. When we look at the research designs by journal, though, then we see a big difference. So these are all the management and organization journals in the Financial Times 50 list that were included in our review. And for those who aren't familiar with the abbreviation, I'm quickly going through those. So AMJ stands for Academy of Management Journal, ASQ for Administrative Science Quarterly, HR for Human Relations, HRM for the Human Resource Management Journal, JAP for Journal of Applied Psychology, JIBS, Journal of International Business Studies, JOM, the Journal of Management, JMS, Journal of Management Studies, OSCE, Organization Science, OSTU, Organization Studies, OBHDP, Organization Behavior and Human Decision-Making Processes, and SMJ, Strategic Management Journal. Depending on the size of your screen, you may or may not be able to see these three shades of grey very clearly, so please do consult the paper. But I think what's obvious here is that some journals publish more interview-based studies over the 10-year period than others. So Human Relations is the one with the most papers in our data set, and OBHDP is the one with the least. Then also what we found very interesting was that some journals publish quite a lot of interview-only research, such as Human Relations, the Human Resource Management Journal, whereas others seem to have a preference more for mixed methods, such as the Academy of Management Journal, Administrative Science Quarterly, and Organization Science and Strategic Management Journal. Others have a bit more of a mix, like Organization Studies. And we also noticed that in our data set, in 3 journals, not a single interview-only study was published in that time frame. And these are the Journal of Applied Psychology, the Journal of Management, and Organization Behavior and Human Decision-Making Processes. Now, we thought that was really interesting because when our PhD students or junior colleagues approach us and say, well, where do you think I should send this paper? There may be bigger chances of publishing a mixed method study in the Academy of Management Journal or the Journal of Management or another outlet where there is a preference for a particular research design than in another journal, or particularly for someone trying to write up and find a good home for an interview-only study, may not go down too well in, for example, the more psychology-focused journals, but maybe much more welcome in a journal such as Human Relations. So actually, this spread will certainly give all of us some thoughts as to where our research might be best received. So in terms of our data analysis, there were some key themes on this slide relating to the methodological practices. In terms of data collection, the most common report of interview protocols was the use of a single one for all research participants. In some studies, it took a more comparative approach. Interview protocols may have been tailored to specific groups, such as in international business studies, for example, expatriates versus local staff, or managers, employees. In some studies, again, more cross-cultural research, interview protocols were provided in different languages. Some studies also mixed more open-ended with more structured interview protocols. So in repeat interviewing, different types of interviewing technique was used. Some studies reported using a small panel for repeat interviewing. And what we found really cool that some people actually use some kind of tool to support the interview, such as pictures, a CV to talk about, using post-it notes to help people illustrate and make sense of a particular phenomenon. So there's some really interesting things out there that have been reported in our data set. In terms of reporting interview questions, most papers gave some kind of indication of what kinds of questions were asked, but there was a wide variety. Some articles did not even mention interview questions and what the topic of the study was, whereas others provided extensive detail, not just about what questions were asked, but also how they were asked. And some provided just an overview in the text, others provided quite extensive detail in the appendix. So we saw a wide variety in this respect. In terms of data analysis, coding was the most prevalent term used to identify key themes or key issues in the data. What was quite interesting to see that some studies split up the sample and compared it, similar to what would be done in a survey, trying to compare the answers of different groups of people. And we also noticed that some papers used quantification practices by which they counted the number of codes used, for example, to claim prevalence of themes. But there were relatively few of those in the overall data set. And then finally on this slide, we also found that some studies specifically used what we termed quality checks. So where they specifically talked about triangulation with very different meanings occasionally. They talked about saturation, and what was interesting there was that discussions of saturation seemed to focus on one of two routes. The first route being data collection continuing to a particular point, and then data analysis starting and stopping once saturation had been identified, which then means that some of the interviews may not have been coded and analyzed. The other route was analyzing the data as data collection was going on and stopping data collection once that point of saturation had been identified. Some studies used inter-rater reliability, and that was absolutely fascinating, certainly for someone like me who does not do numbers in any way, in that most discussions of inter-rater reliability were accompanied by a figure that suggested a degree of agreement between the different coders about a particular code. So far, so good. But there was nowhere near consensus in these articles as to what constituted good or sufficient inter-rater reliability, with some fairly low numbers being deemed sufficient and some fairly high numbers being deemed as just okay. Some papers also used respondent validation and fed back their interpretation to their interviewees to get the interviewees' insights. Generally, with these sections on quality checks, however, we found that they were still quite vague. So, for example, in terms of inter-rater reliability, there was very little insight into, so what did you do when you found you didn't agree? Or in terms of respondent validation, well, what did you do if your respondents did not agree with your interpretation? Key themes in relation to presentational styles include reporting structure and methods of presenting data. The first was placement of interview quotes. And if you'd asked us when we started the project if that would become of interest, we probably would have said no. Because certainly the research I tend to read and the research I tend to do places the interview quotes predominantly in the findings section. And while that was the prevalent practice, there were papers that only placed interview quotes at the beginning of a paper, for example, in the theory section, when hypotheses in mixed method studies were developed. Sometimes they were put at the end of the paper in the discussion where areas for new research was highlighted. In terms of structure of findings, there's a variety of practice again, with thematic structure of findings being the most prevalent. In deductive studies, these themes were predefined, whereas in more inductive studies, they became apparent as part of the analysis process. Some papers structure the findings section in accordance with their guiding questions or with some practices. And some, which again was something we found quite interesting, they used focal cases to discuss in depth the case of a single or a very small number of interviewees. And then finally here, methods of presenting data. We identified 6 methods of presenting interview quotes. The first is no interview quotes were presented at all. The second was what we called a sprinkling of snippets, whereby the author used fairly small sections of spoken word or text when working from the interview transcript and integrated them into a sentence of their own. Then some articles use tables to present the interview data, sometimes just tables on their own, sometimes in conjunction with interview quotes presented in the text. Then we identified what we called the sandwich and the open sandwich. So the sandwich method means that the author introduces the point, provides the interview quote to illustrate that point, and then goes on to interpret and discuss that interview quote. So in this method, in this structure, the words of the interviewee were sandwiched between the words of the author. A variation of that is what we call the open sandwich, even though I think, strictly speaking, it's on its head, whereby, again, the author introduces the point, then provides the quote, but moves on directly to the next point. And then finally, a fairly small number of papers actually provided interview quotes in their interactional sequence. So where you could see a bit of an exchange between the interviewer and the interviewee. Across the data set, transcription was by far the most, verbatim transcription was by far the most prevalent transcription method. And only a very small number of papers in the data set mentioned notation systems. Interestingly, not the more common ones, such as the Jeffersonian in conversation analysis, for example, which they then did not actually apply to their own presentation of quotes. So by the time we got to this stage, I think our heads were a bit swimming with all this variety of practices. And we said, well, there must be some kind of way for us to make sense of all of this. So we went back to Mats Alveson's 3 paradigms of interview-based research. And the first, neo-positivist paradigm, is, as the name suggests, a bit borrowed from positivism and quantitative research. And the emphasis here is on context-free truths in studies in which researchers seek to gather facts about some kind of reality out there, an objective reality that can be studied by a detached researcher. And here, the interviewee's input, bias, as it's often called, is thought to be minimized. And we thought, actually, yes, some of the practices we identified in our data set very much speak to this. So we didn't really look at the interview protocol, but what we did see was a preference for a mixed methods research design and limited reporting of the interview questions. We also found that the studies in our data set that used some kind of quantification through counting the number of codes and or the number of interviewees to demonstrate prevalence or distribution of themes were underpinned by these assumptions. The same applied to any studies translating interview data into numerical form to make statistical claims. It was also the studies that used quality checks such as triangulation, inter-rater reliability, and saturation that seemed to be underpinned by the assumptions of the neo-positivist paradigm. And here it's really the research analysis that is privileged over the respondent. When we looked at the position of interview quotes, in interview-only quotes, they were typically placed in the findings section, but it was in mixed method studies where the interview quotes were typically placed elsewhere. And either the author just summarized interview content, they provided a table, or this sprinkling of snippets, or what we called the open sandwich format. So in this way, we could actually identify some practices that seem to be meaningful within the bigger set of assumptions that underpin the study, and particularly what Alverson calls the neo-positivist paradigm. The second paradigm that Alverson identifies is what he calls romanticist. And that is focused on studying people's inner selves, their worldviews, their authentic experiences. And in this paradigm, the researcher has a really important role. And that is to make the interviewee comfortable, to get them to open up and share what is in their minds in here. So there is a preference for interview only and multiple qualitative methods designs, and a preference for more open-ended interview questions, judging from the descriptions in our data set. And the interview questions in these studies were typically provided in the paper to demonstrate the quality and the appropriateness of the question schedule. Some authors of studies that seem to share these assumptions did show the frequency of codes to demonstrate prevalence, and some also used quality checks such as saturation, but importantly, respondent validation. Triangulation was used more holistically to identify the context in which the interviewee operates, so as to be able to try and explain why their experiences were as they were reported. So in this paradigm, participant interpretation is typically privileged, and hence this importance of respondent validation. Not the researcher interpreting the data, but feeding it back to respondents to see if the researcher gets it right. In these studies, the interview quotes were placed predominantly in the findings section, with prevalence of the sandwich or the open sandwich formats. And now to the third and final paradigm, which Alverson calls localist, which is much more focused on how people assemble versions of themselves in a specific context. Interviews are regarded as a social encounter, and there is much more focus on the interviewer-interviewee interaction, or the culturally available scripts or discourses that people use as part of the interview. So in these studies, there was a preference for interview only or multiple qualitative methods designs, and interview questions where they were fundamental to the analysis, where they're viewed as part of a discourse or a social interaction. And list of interview questions were typically provided, also often with reflection on how questions were asked. And in more interactionist studies, the questions were actually included in the finding section where interviewer-interviewee interaction was reported. In the studies in our data set that seem to be underpinned by these assumptions, triangulation wasn't used or stated. Respondent validation can be used potentially as a source of reflexive insight, going back to the interviewee to discuss reflexively how they thought the interview went and the interaction, what they might have learned from it, from this co-construction of knowledge. But here, neither researcher nor participant interpretation of data is privileged, and claims about saturation aren't typically made. The interview quotes again were typically placed in the findings section, with the sandwich or the open sandwich formats prevalent in reporting interview quotes. And there was just one subfield within the localist paradigm that was more informed by ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, that used more sophisticated transcripts, so going beyond the verbatim. I'm now handing over to Andrea to share with us some reflections on the implications for research quality. Over to you, Andrea.
Oh, thanks, Stefanie. Hi, everybody. So what can we take away from this piece of research that we've done, reviewing 225 interview-based studies in some of these so-called leading journals, albeit not every single journal is included. We focus mainly on management and organisation studies. Well, the first thing we can really take away is that because we found such diversity and plurality in the practices that we observed in these 225, then we can conclude that there doesn't appear to be, at least in the discipline of management and organisation studies, there doesn't appear to be any one best way of presenting and writing up interview-based data. So there doesn't appear to be one single gold standard through which, for example, for education and training purposes, if we're to be doing doctoral training or training early career researchers, for example, that there doesn't appear to be any one single best way that we can write up in a textbook or teach to people who are starting off doing this kind of research. However, we need to think back to that slide that Stefanie presented, which showed the variety between the journals in the data set that we looked at. So it was a stark contrast between those different journals, which are underpinned by different kinds of disciplines. So, for example, the journals that were very much grounded in an economics discipline, such as some of the strategy journals, or disciplines underpinned by social psychology, for example, then it's clear that within those areas of research and within those journals, they may have their own ideas about what the gold standard is. So, for example, the fact that you do not find interview-only studies, and you especially do not find interview-only studies underpinned by a romanticist or a localist paradigm in some journals, suggests that actually for those journals, the gold standard does exist. And for their editorial boards and their review boards with their standards and expectations, then the neo-positivist paradigm could be interpreted as the gold standard for those journals. So we can conclude that there's no single best way, even though specific journals might have their own interpretation of what is best and what is doing proper or good qualitative research. We also can't conclude that because we've laid out in this review piece a variety, a smorgasbord, if you like, of different practices for talking about your methodology in the methodology section and presenting your data. It doesn't mean that we can just go ahead and pick and choose, a bit like a child in front of a kind of pick and mix of sweets, just selecting the ones that they fancy and putting them all in the bag. And there's good reasons for that, because as we've pointed out by showing how they cluster together according to different onto-epistemological paradigms and the different philosophical assumptions that those paradigms have about the nature of language use, for example, in interviews, whether language should be seen as something that is a neutral medium through which to find out what goes on out there in the real world and can be done so in an objective and unbiased ways, versus those more social constructionist or interpretivist paradigms, which view language as a form of social construction or a form of performance, for example. So what can we say then about this plurality and diversity? I'm going to give you two different ways of interpreting it. So on the one hand, you could say, well, what a blessing this is, that we found out of these 225 that there's no one best way. There's no single template. There's no gold standard. It's a blessing because it values diversity. And it allows people to do different types of interview-based research that are grounded in the different kinds of onto-epistemological paradigms, which are alive and well in the social sciences and alive and well in not every business school around the world, but in many there is that plurality in the methodological preferences and also the onto-epistemological assumptions. It can also be a blessing if we think about when we are going through the process of trying to publish our own research, and perhaps we get editors or reviewers who don't appreciate the kinds of quality standards that we use within the paradigm we're working within. So if you're in a situation where, for example, you've presented some work or submitted some work, and you're getting comments back that are critical, but the reason why they're critical is because that person can't understand the kinds of approaches that are appropriate within the paradigm that you've used, it can be quite empowering to be able to go back and point out that perhaps they're using a different paradigm and that your work should be judged from within the paradigm that you're working within. So that's if we interpret this as a blessing. There may be people out there who are saying this is not a blessing, this is a curse, and this is a major problem. It might be a major problem for people who, for example, want qualitative methods to be much more alike quantitative methods. Within the quantitative approaches, there is typically a gold standard. There is typically a best or most robust way of doing a particular statistical technique, for example. So some people could be bemoaning this and saying this is a major problem and qualitative research is being held back by the absence of this gold standard. Another way in which it is a bit of a curse is for colleagues who are at the beginning of their qualitative research career, whether they're PhD students or whether they're more established researchers who are using qualitative methods for the first time. Because the absence of this gold standard, the absence of any textbook that can just say there is only one best way to do this and here's how it should be done, can actually be very unhelpful and can be very confusing. But to that end, that's why we thought, rather than just say, oh, here's all the plurality, here's all the diversity, do what you want, we thought it'd make more sense for us to cluster together those practices to show how they make sense and are deemed to be valuable and valid in those three different paradigms. And finally, we can conclude then that this plurality and diversity really means that there is conflict and there is division, even within qualitative researchers. So it's not a case of a big happy family where everybody agrees on how we should be conducting qualitative interviews and how we should be writing them up. Rather, you can see the kind of conflict and division between those mixed method studies, for example, using certain approaches grounded in positivism and grounded ultimately in quantitative research. And you can see the tension then with those who are much more informed, for example, by social constructionism or post-structural approaches or symbolic interactionist approaches. Thanks, Stefanie. Next slide, please. I'll do Chris Whitty now. Thank you. One area of concern which other people such as Cathy Cassell and Gillian Simon and Anne Cunliffe have already been pointing out as a major concern is the development towards creating quality standards for qualitative research, which are actually grounded in the positivistic logic of quantitative research. So we do need to be cautious. We agree with those scholars. We need to be cautious about developing quality assessment criteria, such as quantification of interview material, setting certain standards for sample size, for example, using techniques such as inter-rater reliability, introducing tables where we number the number of codes that we used when coding our data, that we need to exercise caution when introducing those as one-size-fits-all standards, because they do not recognize the kinds of quality standards that might be different and incompatible within, for example, the romanticist or localist paradigm. So, for example, the romanticist and localist paradigm might place more emphasis on reflexivity as a way of ensuring research quality. And reflexivity is here about understanding the crucial role that the researcher, him or herself, is playing in creating the data and being able to reflect on and think about what that influence might have been and use that to inform their own practice and also inform the way that they interpret the data that they produce. Thank you. Next slide. So we wanted to just end by telling you a bit more about what really surprised us. What did we expect to find and what we were surprised to find when we looked at these 225 articles. And Stefanie's already mentioned a few of these, and I'll just emphasize those further. It did surprise us when we were looking for interview studies to find that people were placing the interview quotes not in the findings section, but actually outside of the findings section. We must admit that this is probably more to do with our own methodological biases than anything else. So I'm not as familiar with mixed method studies. So it was a surprise to both of us, I think, to find that people are placing interview quotes only in the introduction section or only in the theory section where they're developing their hypotheses. And that in mixed method studies, you often find that in the abstract, the authors say that we combine, say, interviews and an experiment, or interviews and a questionnaire survey, or interviews and an analysis of a pre-existing database. But yet, when it comes to actually presenting the findings, the interviews get relegated to a kind of lesser position and are not treated with the same status and accorded the same amount of page space as the quantitative studies. And again, that probably reflects something about the way that the journal editors and the editorial board of reviewers is judging quality. Second thing that really surprised us, given that we assume that inter-rater reliability, grounded as it is in the neo-positivist paradigm, grounded as it is in the kind of positivistic logic of quantitative research, we assumed that where we did find people talking about it, then there would be one standard measure and there would be one standard magical number or benchmark that people had to reach in order to claim to have reliably coded. And by reliably coded here, they were referring to multiple coders all agreeing that the codes applied in the same way. So we did not find that. There was not one method, there was multiple different systems used. As Stefanie mentioned, there was many different ideas about what the correct number should be to claim inter-rater reliability. And there was just such a lack of transparency in the way that this was written up. You had no idea most of the time who those multiple coders were. You have no idea which particular codes did not reach inter-rater agreement. And you have absolutely no idea, when agreement wasn't reached, what happened to make the interpretation of one of those coders supersede and override the interpretation of the other coders. Now, clearly, this doesn't even make sense to do from an interpretivist or social constructionist approach. It would rather be used as a method of, for example, working out what different kinds of methods of interpretation different readers of the same text may reach as a result of their different ways of interpreting the same words. And then finally, we found something that we didn't know existed. So apologies if this is our ignorance, but when I thought about saturation, I was only really aware of saturation in the coding process, which is during the process of analysis itself. So that's where you're going through rounds of coding of your data and you claim to reach saturation when you say, and I couldn't find any new way of grouping these sections of interview transcript into these codes that I've decided upon. But there was a different type that Stefanie mentioned earlier. This other type is where you undertake the analysis during the process of collecting your interviews. And you say that you had a potentially bigger sample of people to interview, but you stopped interviewing at a particular point where, for example, you found that each new person you interviewed wasn't giving you any new insights. In other words, you weren't producing new codes as a result of each additional interview that you were doing. And at that point, would be a justification given by the authors to stop the process of collecting any more data. And finally, a really nice idea that we took away from this is, instead of just presenting interview quote after interview quote from your entire sample of interviewees, a really nice approach, which we found as readers of these articles really illuminated and really highlighted particular individuals that, for want of a better term, we called focal cases. So you do present some examples from your wider data set, but you then focus in on one person who effectively becomes a case study for this particular theoretical point that you want to illustrate. And the benefit of that then is that rather than just having lots of interview quotes taken out of their context, and by context we're referring to all the things you might need to know about a person to understand their experiences and understand why they think and see the world the way they do. The advantage then of a focal case is that you're able to give more of that contextual detail for that individual to try to understand a bit more about how they see the world and why they experience it in the way that they do. Great, next slide. So to sum up then, we have seen paradigmatic pluralism alive and well. It's alive and well in the discipline, but it's more patchy when it comes to which particular journal is publishing different types of research using Alberson's 3 paradigms. We share the concerns that others have expressed about the tendency for particularly positivistic quality criteria to be deemed to be the standard that is required for qualitative research. And we would like to think, particularly the social constructionist, narrative, or symbolic interactionist approaches and post-structuralist approaches remain deemed valid within our discipline. And we hope that what we've done is not only helpful for early career researchers or those new to using this method, but in particular, we hope it also resonates with what Simon and Cassell called the institutional gatekeepers of our field. So these are the journal editors, the reviewers, the conference committees, and the doctoral examiners who might need to be reminded of this pluralism. And we might all need to be empowered to go back to those who question the particular style that we use and remind them that there is diversity, and that diversity needs to be recognized and acknowledged. So thanks, everyone. I think we are exactly on 1 hour.
Great. I think I'll stop sharing. And then let's have a look at the Q&A box. So thank you for everyone who has provided a question. So the first question was, why is the Journal of Business Ethics not included in the list? Just curious. Andrea, can you remember? I don't think they're part of the FT50, or are they?
So funnily enough, I looked it up while you were speaking. And you're right, Sadia, they are on the FT50 list. And I think I remember about 3 years ago, we started this project, wasn't it? We wanted to just look at those that are management and organization studies. And we didn't include a lot of others. So we didn't include CSR and business ethics. We didn't include accounting, economics, marketing, entrepreneurship, information systems, and lots of others. So to answer your question, Sadia, it's not that we don't think the Journal of Business Ethics is relevant or interesting. It definitely is. But we just didn't really have the ability and scope as just a team of 2 researchers doing this coding manually to include all of the FT50 journals, or indeed all of the journals on the ABS list. And it would be fantastic to replicate this study if anybody's interested in doing such a project. It'd be really interesting to replicate this in other subject areas and, for example, or widen the scope to include JBE. So thank you.
Great. Then we have a question. Why is it hard to publish interview-based research relating to various organizational issues?
Good question. Is it hard? I don't know. I mean, our numbers suggest that, of course, like when we put it into that broader picture, Mohammed, I think you've got a point, obviously, because I remember being at a presentation years ago and they were talking about just the qualitative quantitative split in journals. And I remember some figure like 90% of journal space is quantitative. So for us people in our community doing qualitative research, you've got a valid point, because it's already, we have a smaller amount of journal space available to us. Within qualitative methods themselves, my best guess, but I don't have the numbers to back this up, my best guess is interview-based research is the most prevalent within qualitative. Would you get that impression as well, Stefanie?
Yes, absolutely. And I think in the paper we cited the study by Bloom et al., that review 2011, who argued that actually, yes, interviews are the most common qualitative method in our field. So yeah, absolutely.
So I think to answer your question then, Mohammed, we would say it's harder than quantitative because there's less journal space dedicated to it. And that's particularly in some journals, as we showed, where they simply publish none. But when you are publishing interview-based research, the crucial thing to think about is, you know, which of the paradigms are you locating yourself within, and making it clear that they have their own systems for assessing quality. And it's reassuring to see so many journals are indeed publishing this kind of research, which isn't just from the neo-positivist paradigm, for example.
And I think the other thing is being consistent within your paradigm as well. So not being tempted to bring in a practice from another paradigm. So for example, triangulation to check for facts has no role in what Alderson calls the localist paradigm, or studies that are underpinned by the assumptions of a localist paradigm. So I think that's what I would add to Andrea's answer there. Then we've got a question here. Did you look at how these themes differences according to analytical methods? I would assume the findings would be quite different depending on whether someone uses, for example, discourse analysis, thematic analysis, narrative analysis. I would be interested to hear if certain analytical methods were more prevalent than others.
Absolutely. And the answer is yes. And so, for example, your discourse analysis is much more associated with the localist paradigm, and therefore would be much more associated with practices such as reflexivity, much more associated with the practice of not only giving what the interviewee said, but showing the interaction between the interviewee and the interviewer, for example. Thematic analysis was used in all three paradigms. It's not that you found that neo-positivists were not saying they did thematic analysis. They did, but they tended to do things like showing the numbers of segments of text coded within each theme, showing the number of interviewees coded according to each theme, doing other forms of quantification practices, and saying that they've done things like inter-rater reliability. And then when it comes to narrative analysis, it's much more associated with, for example, the romanticist paradigm, trying to understand the stories that people tell from their own authentic experiences and lived experiences, from their own perceptions, from their own worldviews. So I think that's a very good question. And absolutely, the two are intimately connected with one another. The type of analysis method you use has to fit the type of paradigm that you're adopting.
Great. So our next question is, how can we predict the importance of using a specific type of interview and paradigm?
Oh, good question. Do you know what that means? We might need you to post it again and explain a bit more.
I mean, I've got a guess, but please correct me if I'm wrong by putting it back in the chat. I think what's really important to highlight here is that none of these paradigms is better than any of the others per se. And the paradigms are really about how you see the world and how you regard good knowledge being created. And we do that in different ways. So I think a point we certainly did not want to make here is that one paradigm is better than any of the others. They're all of equal value. even though some journals have a preference, or some disciplines have a preference for a particular paradigm. And that is why Andrea said earlier, it's so important to be clear of your understanding of your paradigm and the assumptions that you bring to your study.
And just building on that, obviously, we're hoping to keep this pluralism alive and well in our field. That's our personal and political agenda. We don't want to see a situation where, for example, the dominant paradigm, when you think about all of the journals, for example, in the FT list, for example, or when you think about the kinds of journal space that's available for different types of research. What we would not want to happen is for example, the neo-positivist paradigm to be deemed as the only valid way of doing this. And of course, we recognize the conflict here. So we can't deny who we are and what type of research that we do, underpinned by a different, maybe a social constructionist or an interpretivist or an interactionist paradigm. So yes, we would have live debates with people who take other paradigms and believe that the world can be objectively and reliably measured, and that language is merely a neutral tool for describing the real world out there. So obviously, we would disagree with those others, and those others would have active disagreements with us and say that our paradigm is, for example, not valid. So yeah, that's why it's so important, I think, to be able to recognize that the standards that one group of scholars might uphold, perhaps it's to do with the way that they were trained. You know, you can be trained as a social scientist very differently in your bachelor's, your master's, and your PhD programs. But at least being able to say, I might not agree with you, but I still allow this kind of research to be conducted. And I allow doctoral students to get their doctoral degrees, and I allow this kind of research to be conducted in business schools, for example.
So the next question is, so say for instance, you have to compare and assess the quality of 4 different qualitative papers. Would you say there are other big criteria except sample size and reflexivity to judge the quality?
Yes, I think the answer to that one would be, it depends on the nature of the study and the paradigm that they're using. So clearly, if it was a neo-positivist piece of work, then the kinds of key things that a reviewer or an editor would be looking for is not just sample size, but for example, they might want to see details of the coding process. They might want to see the number of segments of text that had been coded in each of these codes to find out which ones were more prevalent. They might want to see things like inter-rater reliability. Although bear in mind that one thing that we were very surprised about, I wrote down the numbers earlier, inter-rater reliability or intercoder reliability was only actually mentioned in 25 articles. So when we're saying all of these things, it doesn't mean that it's an absolute must do or must have, even in the neo-positivist paradigm, even if you're using interviews alongside quantitative methods, for example, in a mixed method study. Saturation was only used in 30 articles. So what's clear is that these judgments about quality aren't really a tick box list. So it's not that as a reviewer, you get a paper that is about a topic that you have expertise in, and you are literally looking for names to be dropped, terms to be dropped, such as saturation, reflexivity, inter-rater reliability, respondent validation, or member checking. It's clear that there's a lot of scholarship that gets deemed to be of a sufficient quality by those gatekeepers, even though they don't actually tick the box of name dropping those particular concepts or terms.
So the next question is, what's an efficient way to identify preferred methodologies, theories, language, etc. for specific journals, or vice versa, identifying suitable journals for once used methods, theories, languages, etc. And I suppose that is read widely similar kinds of studies in that particular journal, so that you get a feel for what is the expectation, maybe the preference for what kind of methodologies, theories, language, etc. in that particular journal in this particular moment in time. What
And
would
they're
you say, Andrea?
two sides of the same coin, aren't they? So it depends on whether you want the cart before the horse. So is it that you're interested in a topic area because you're a subject expert in that topic area and you're not sure which methods to use? In which case, have a look at the kinds of journals which you would be eventually targeting at the very end of the study process, and then retrospectively go back and say, okay, well, it looks like those are the best methodologies for me to use. Alternatively, you can put it the other way around and flip the coin, and you can say, no, I am an interview-based researcher. That's what I do. That's my specialism, my methodological specialism. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and do my study. And then later on, when I'm getting ready to write it up, I then do exactly as you said, Stefanie, you go and have a look, and you can replicate what we did, but just for a specific journal or subset of journals. So I think we just use either Scopus or Business Source Complete to literally search for the word interviews in abstract, title, and keywords. We search lots of journals, but you could just search 2 or 3 that are within your subject area to figure out where that fit is. But we have to be really careful here, because we've done this study and because we've shown you that chart. We don't want, as a community of qualitative researchers, to then reinforce and further solidify these kinds of divisions between the different journals. So in an ideal world, qualitative and interview-based research and other qualitative research should be in all of these journals. But then again, that's my biased viewpoint as a qualitative researcher, clearly, and not everyone would agree. Clearly, the people who are the editors of organizational behavior and human decision-making processes strongly disagree with me and do not ever want to publish interview-only studies, at least, and are only interested in mixed methods.
So the next question, I'm also interested in the above question, so the one we've just answered, regarding analytical approach and how much you can devote in a journal article to explaining this. I feel it's important to be transparent. And I think absolutely you're right, transparency is really important, because it will give you an opportunity to explain more about the assumptions underpinning your approach and the practices that you've used, to give the reader a chance to evaluate what you have done. But of course, there are limitations in terms of word count that we're all facing, I think, and that is probably why we're also have been left with questions about, so how did you actually overcome any conflict when it came to integrator reliability or respondent validation? Probably part of that was, well, something had to go, and that was what was cut as part of the editorial process. I don't know your approach, Andrea. I think I'm always guided by the reviewers as to how much they want. I mean, start off with as much detail as I think is necessary and is important, and I can share within the word limit. Is there anything else we can do, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the question as well in terms of like how much we need to be explicit. And you know, we're using these labels for these paradigms just because it's helpful, you know, because Alverson and also David Silverman, who's written about 3 different distinct paradigms, because it's useful terminology, but it's not a requirement. I mean, these terms, by the way, were not in any of the articles that we were looking at. So it's not like, and, you know, the start of the methodology section is, and I am a neopositivist, or I am a romanticist. It's not even a label that people use. So when you're writing your methodology, it'll become quite clear which approach you're using, more by what you say you did do, what you say your overall rationale was, and what kind of methodological literature you're citing, and also what kind of theoretical approach you're using. So if someone's using narrative analysis or discourse analysis or dramaturgical approaches or Foucauldian approaches, then it kind of comes as a package. So it's kind of easy for then the editor, who's going to be deciding which reviewers to send it to, who's going to understand and hopefully be sympathetic to the particular approach you're using. So I wouldn't say you need to label it, but what you include and what you say you did and what paradigm you belong to will become apparent just by the kinds of literature that you're going to be citing in your methodology section.
Fabulous. So next question is, you mentioned that there's no gold standard, but what did you identify as the most frequent poor practices to be avoided?
Oh my goodness, so that's really hard to answer, isn't it? Because like myself and Stefanie might have our own views about some of these things and go, that's awful. And I think we had some private comments to each other during the coding process about, oh, can't believe they've done that or failed to do that or made that claim. But we have to bear in mind that to even get into our sample, it had to have got through quite a rigorous process of peer review and past editorial judgments. So you can imagine that what we would think of as a poor practice clearly doesn't reflect, but we can tell you what we subjectively, and without wanting to offend any author in our sample of 225, ones that stuck out to me were papers which had the word interview mentioned in the abstract title or keyword, but produced not one single interview quote in the entire article. So for me, that's a poor practice. Because if the point of qualitative research is to say something about how people experience the world, about how their meaning systems work, about how their interpretations and perceptions work, then to reduce what the participants themselves have said in the interviews to just something that can be paraphrased by the author themselves, I think is doing a disservice to the whole raison d'etre of qualitative research. So that's one poor practice. The other poor practice we've already talked about, which was around inter-rater reliability. More poor practices around complete inconsistency in the use of words like saturation and also triangulation, which was used to mean very, very different things. The practices of quantification. And this is, again, just a very personal, subjective judgment about what I would perceive as poor, but clearly other people don't. Quantification of qualitative data is hugely problematic in my personal view. And in fact, I was delighted to see one of the articles in our sample say in their methodology section that they started off quantifying and counting words. And they stopped for two reasons. First of all, they realized that just because two people said the same word, it doesn't mean that it meant the same thing, because meaning, of course, is interpretation in context, not just the use of a word itself. And secondly, this obsession with frequently recurring keywords was detracting them from what was really meaningful and important in their data. And it was also detracting them from trying to figure out what was not said as well as what was said. Did you have any, Stefanie, in terms of stuff that stuck out to you as
I think one we discussed quite a bit, and it was one that you coded, whereby the analysts developed a label as part of the analysis process and then use that to label individuals. So It wasn't just saying, you know, this is the code we used and here is an interview quote to support that code, but they actually labeled people through these probably somewhat randomly generated codes as part of the analysis process. And I remember us having long conversations about this and thinking, well, this is actually really problematic from our point of view, because these are not categories that anyone would have used by themselves.
Yeah, so they're not in terms of a more anthropological approach to qualitative research, where you're interested in the meaning systems of the people you're studying. That is literally the opposite of that, which is saying, I've come up with a category as an analyst. I think one of them was dividing people into high political skill and low political skill. And having done that labeling, then presented the data in those two categories, which were not categories that were used by the people themselves. So it wasn't that they spontaneously said in their interview, oh, I think my political skills are quite low. It was something that the analyst had decided and then applied and then divided people into two groups and then was comparing the responses of these two groups that they didn't perceive themselves in, but rather the analysts had decided that they were. And that would be something which, if they did do respondent validation or member checking, can you imagine going back to your respondents and saying, oh, just to let you know, I've categorized you as very low political skill. What do you think about that? You can just imagine how people might respond to being categorized as such by an analyst.
Next question is, any insights on the temporal evolution of the interview-based methodology in the investigated sample?
Ooh, I think if by temporal evolution you mean did it change from 2009 to 2019? I would love to say, oh, hi, Emanuela. I would love to say that we would be able to answer it, but alas, we didn't, because we don't have a way with the in vivo coding that we did. We don't have a way of then tracing anything over time. We can go back with some of the more quantitative measures we did, so some word searches. We can probably go back on those and say, for example, was there a tendency towards an increase in people talking about inter-rater reliability or saturation? So that's the only thing we could probably say, but it doesn't strike me as something which has been a big movement over those 10 years. Does it you, Stefanie?
No, but then I haven't thought about it because, as I said earlier, I don't do numbers, I'm afraid. I have no brain for numbers. So not even, so even simple counting, I think, gets to me. I can probably do, you know, sort of count them manually and put some lines on a sheet of paper and count them afterwards, but that's as sophisticated as it gets with me. So no,
Yeah.
It's not something we have looked at, but again, I think that would be really interesting to see if someone has the time and the capacity, if there's actually more work using interview-based research being published now than it was, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago.
And indeed, not just like more being published compared to the past. That would be fascinating if we could replicate this study, but go even further back. So, because we've just done basically the last decade, but it'd be really interesting to go back further in time and say, take the 3 or 4 decades before then to be able to say something more meaningful to answer that question, to say, is it getting more prevalent, but also a particular practice is getting more prevalent? So is it that nowadays we're talking much more in terms of respondent validation, whereas in the past we were using terms like inter-rater reliability? Yeah, definitely.
Great. Next question is, did you note the approximate number of interviews on which each of the papers was based, the minimum, maximum? I'm thinking of interview-only articles.
No, we didn't, but we can point you to a paper. Can we maybe put it in the chat? There's been a piece of research, was it by Mark Saunders?
Yeah.
So Mark Saunders has published the answer to your question, because the review piece that Mark did, was it published in
BJM?
British Journal of Management, and he looked at a sample of interview-only studies and looked at exactly this question of what is a good number, what's deemed to be an appropriate or good number of interviewees.
Fabulous. So I'm afraid that many times quantitative methodology might sneak into any qualitative type research, just shared as a comment. So yes, absolutely. And I think that is what we've seen in the review, that some of the assumptions that underpin quantitative research very much are part of interview-based research, which we so often regard as a qualitative method. So thank you for that. So this
Although I wanted to follow that up by saying, I'm not against quantification. It can be part of what you can call the context setting, and that's really valuable. So, for example, one piece of research I did wasn't with interviews, but it was looking at metaphors that were being used in newspaper articles. And part of that, you might want to count those just to be able to say which ones were prevalent and which ones weren't. But that does not then replace or do the work of your qualitative analysis, because you still have to say something that's meaningful about what those metaphors were, for example. So quantification is not that it has no place, it's just that it has a place in just helping almost the reader to appreciate a large data set. But then you still have to do the hard work, which is to actually present it in a qualitative fashion and then do the process of interpretation. That's obviously the difficult, but also the most rewarding step. There was one other question I think that we missed. As an early career researcher, how do you decide which paradigm to select for your work?
Yeah, I've answered that in writing. I always recommend to my student the HARP questionnaire, Heightened Awareness of Research Paradigms, developed by Mark Saunders and co-authors. And it's in his handbook and in his textbook. And basically it gives you an indication of how you see the world, and it's then something that you can discuss with, if you're a doctoral student, your supervisor, or if you're an early career researcher, with your mentor, and then take it from there. So if you have a look at the Saunders et al. Textbook about business research methods, or research methods for business students, whichever way around it is included in there. So you can search it up in the index, and it doesn't take long to use, but it's certainly a starting point for you to think about and discuss.
And building on that, it's also about what your question is, because some questions just need quantitative data. And then some questions need qualitative, but that isn't just the answer. Oh, it needs qualitative. It's which type of qualitative. So if you're trying to understand like a real world process, actually interviews aren't a great method. You actually probably need something like participant or non-participant observation, or you might even need an ethnography, because it's actually something about the evolution of interactions in organizations that you're interested in. Interviews are much better if you want people to talk retrospectively about a particular experience or a particular event, but they're not, of course, reliable ways of getting people to talk about what really happens in organizations. It's only the neo-positivists who would say, well, they can be if you just design them well and you analyze them well. But of course, from the other paradigms, that doesn't make sense to say that. So you're more interested in just how they talk about a particular phenomenon rather than how they actually do that phenomenon in practice.
Yeah, I've just been asked about the references. So the ones are obviously anything that we talked about will be in the paper, except some of the additional resources I mentioned. So I've just thank you to David and Emanuela. They've already put them in. I've just added the Braun and Clark, and will add the Saunders textbook as well, so that you can follow it up.
Oh yeah, good question. So we've got a question about the range of paradigms covered by positivist and constructivist or constructionist researchers, not only the ones from Alverson. Why have we chosen that? Probably because we thought that the readership would be much more familiar with the work of Matt Salverson, because he's written quite a lot already about interview-based research. But there are many more. And in fact, one of the tensions that one of the challenges and dilemmas we faced was the fact that the localist paradigm is actually subsuming many, many different types of approaches. It's not only covering symbolic interactionism and Goffmanian work, it's covering ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, but also we have to find somewhere for social constructionist, discourse analytic, and also post-structuralist work. So people who are, for example, inspired by the work of Michel Foucault also don't fit easily into the other two. So I think it's a very valid question. There aren't just those three. And especially within the latter, within the localist, it probably needs to be broken down an awful lot further. And there are, of course, other categorization systems for talking about ontology and epistemology. And the famous and influential one is clearly by Gibson-Burrell in Burrell and Morgan's framework. So that's another place you can go to think through all of the different kinds of social scientific approaches that we can take to knowledge generation.
Fabulous. So Eliza's just reminded us we've got under a minute to wrap up. So I think thank you so much for being here with us for the super questions. I hope it's been helpful. And again, a big thank you to David, BAM and Eliza for all their hard work. So if there's any questions or issues, please do drop us a line. Our email addresses are at on the title slide. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.